So Cliff got a wild hair and thought it might be interesting for us to release a short episode about sort of the why behind this thing. So we've done 3 seasons at this point, 24 episodes, and some community has started to build around this thing, and it's been really awesome and really heartening for us that like people are listening at all and care. So we wanted to talk to those people and say, like, what do you dig? What do you not dig? And some pretty interesting conversations came out of that. So thank you to everybody who responded to our posts on social and made the time to share some really great, meaningful feedback. It just goes to show that this is something that we all care about a lot. Music, not this podcast.
Well, some of the feedback that we got, that to be honest with you, I wasn't really expecting, was basically, hey guys, we don't know a lot about you and we'd like to know more. And like my immediate reaction is like, why? Right? Like kind of the premise of what we've been trying to do is to kind of disassociate our particular selves from all the meaty conversation that can be had about a record. Like we format this thing as a conversation because that's a good way to draw out some new ways of talking about music. And I think it makes sense to talk about that like in contrast, because we've done that on purpose the entire time, right? Episode number 1 just basically dives right into Stankonia and doesn't do a lot of setup or really even introduce us or talk about why we're talking about it. Because the whole thing was, if we're going to do this format and give it a shot, let's see if it actually works that way. So to talk about it in contrast is, if you're looking for a music podcast with a couple of dudes who are, as AV Club recently described us, alabaster skinned, that sort of podcast is not in short supply. You can go find a lot of them. But there are 2 things that we did differently from the beginning. One of them is way more important than the other, but they both add up to a collective whole. One, and most importantly, instead of doing the very traditional, podcasts are an extension of how radio shows used to work. So we're going to spin up the episode, talk about ourselves, talk about how difficult podcasting is, talk about the technical difficulties that we're having, make sure other people are actually recording first, make a bunch of weird jokes that don't have anything to do with anything, and then like 25 minutes later get into the actual thing that you were here to maybe listen to this episode about. If you're there to hear a bunch of people sit around and talk, there are much better podcasts to listen to.
Go to a bar.
Exactly.
So call it punk rock guilt, call it what you will, but there were a couple of things that you and I had conversations about before we started this podcast that like our friends who have been like, hey, I checked out your podcast, have heard us say to them in person, but we've never said anywhere else. So we had kind of as a rule of thumb when we started, the episode about the album can't be longer than the album itself, because like, what do we have to say that's more important than the actual expression? All roads should ultimately lead to like, please go listen to this album. So we just want to be a primer and send you down the rabbit hole. So that's where the social media stuff becomes important. Like check out the Twitter threads. If you get really into an episode or the things we talk about or the subject matter, it's intended to be just enough to make you want to go chase after more. But if you're not into it, you've only lost 30 to 40 minutes or so.
And speaking of those 30 to 40 minutes, like I think maybe it's helpful to say out loud, since people have been asking about the podcast itself. What you're listening to is a very edited version of our conversation for the reasons that we just brought up earlier, right? It seems like kind of a waste of time for you to hear all of our like warm up and in between, things that might not make sense, things we couldn't remember, us saying for like 15 seconds and not meditating, just trying to figure out what we're going to say next. And so like we work really hard at making sure, one, the audio clips you get in these episodes are literally the highest quality we can find anywhere. But then secondly, we edit for content, we edit for filler words. We try to make this thing as dense as humanly possible so that you can just walk away with what we were trying to say, not necessarily having to listen to an hour and a half and sort through all the details on it.
Yeah, we don't want to be the beginning and the end of the conversation about any of this stuff, because we can't be, because it's impossible to be. Certainly not from our position and our perspectives and like the kinds of music that we have and haven't listened to over our 3 decades of life. You know, the thing that you said initially about us not really introducing ourselves that much, I think the other thing is we started this podcast with a little bit of a G code in mind of like, we're not going to do any of the things that we hate about podcasts. And one of them was to be too person driven. Like, hey, I'm Kyle and I'm Cliff. And, yeah. So I am Kyle.
And I'm Cliff.
And if you could just track those voices throughout the time you're listening to an episode, either that or we can watermark under our own voices. Like, Kyle. Every 15 seconds or so. But to us, it's a little bit of a like, to Cliff's point, this stage is your stage type of thing, not to be too like hardcore kid about it. Like we do just want it to be a vessel. Like we're just two people and we're kind of just doing it for ourselves. And that's why we're psyched that anybody else would care at all. But we don't want to insert too much of ourselves in the conversation because who are we to do that?
Yeah, to your point, that was going to be the other thing I was mentioning that we do differently from other people is we literally, when we listen to podcasts, are basically taking notes on what other people are doing that feels really annoying. So like one clear example, and this is for real, you can go listen to other white dudes talk about music on podcasts. We are probably the only one who can go an entire episode without making a dick joke. It's unbelievable. But just like we're really thoughtful about the type of thing that we actually talk about in this episode. Yeah, we fancy ourselves funny on occasion. I think it's important to bring some humor to a conversation. But I don't think 5-year-old humor has anything to do with it and runs people off. And like, yeah, we don't want to be special individuals, but we take it really seriously. That's why hopefully to you, it sounds good. It's well edited. It's dense. We do our work ahead of time. Again, it's not one where we show up, and I'm shocked how many other music podcasts I listen to where the guy's like, well, yeah, that was the opinion I got when I listened to it for the first time yesterday. Like, this is literally like dick jokes, reading Wikipedia, and then guys who have never listened to a record giving their initial opinion based on 24 hours of exposure to it, and then ship that in a 2-hour format.
I feel bad about some of the first season episodes, like because we only spent X amount of time, or it was records that we knew really, really well, and I maybe took it a little bit for granted. Like I listened back to the Portishead episode recently, and I was I give that a C+. So that's what we're striving for.
You're talking about the episode, you give a C+, right?
Not the album.
I was like, excuse me?
It was episode number 3 for a reason. Yeah, I think the thing is we have so much respect for these albums that we maybe put a little more thought into it than we should. But really, we see this thing as more like an art project, like a body of work, where when we look back on it after 50 or 100 or more episodes, it's a collection of tributes to things that are unique and different out in the music world and have made a difference in people's lives, even if they've had no impact on ours. Thinking back to like me and Husker Du in the first season, and just investigating like, why do these things mean so much? Like, what is the special and unique thing? So it's not going to be like a dissect where we're taking apart each piece of the musical DNA, and it's not going to be like one of those shows where they interview a different musician every time about their favorite album. We're just trying to like carve out our little thing. And also, the main thing is I don't want 30 minutes of ads or bullshitting on the front end of the thing. I always skip past that. So part of the like, keep it short, don't bore us, get to the chorus thing is like, it makes me physically ill. I don't know how y'all listen to Joe Rogan, like 3 hours an episode. I guess for every one of him, there's 10 people who think they're Joe Rogan. And it's like, hey, you checked out Blue Apron? That shit's tough, man. Help you get gains. That's blueapron.com.
I can't cook for myself, so I love it when people send me boxes with all the instructions ahead of time.
Pay by numbers for your mouth.
Legalize it.
Not that we're opposed to advertising.
Or legalizing it.
That's right. We'll accept certain types of sponsors or content partners. Most of them, however, we will not.
Normal, we'll take your money.
Who was it? Goody from Goody Mob started a cannabis brand. Gip, hit us up because I know you're listening right now.
But like a consequence of making these decisions, right? Like we're thoughtful about the format. And one of the things that we exchange, I think, for the brevity or density, I guess, of an episode is, and also just accepting the format of what we do, right? Like you mentioned Dissect. Other podcasts like that, which you can tell are, or anything, produced by NPR, was written and is being, kind of recited in audio. And it's awesome. It kind of sounds like a short audiobook or something like that. Hopefully it's fairly obvious from listening to us talk, but like, we're not doing that, right? We're not writing ahead of time. What we are doing is taking all of the time and immersion and research we already know these albums for the most part, but we spend a lot of time, specifically you and I, digging back into it, learning about it, figuring out things that would help us understand more about it than we had before. And we kind of create a shell of a thing. We create some main items that we want to talk about because we think it'll be really interesting or will drive people towards listening to the record more. But we let the conversation actually take place. We don't really know what every episode is going to sound like before we actually record it. And that's there because we're trying to recreate a little bit of our actual conversations about stuff, right? But so one of the trade-offs in that is we, as people who care a lot about every album we talk about, are never going to, one, be able to cover everything that we really want to talk about in an episode, or two, even be able to talk about all the points we're trying to make to the extent that's necessary to really communicate it every time to people. We sort of know walking in on every single episode, there's going to be things that we talk about that people are going to misunderstand. Especially if you're listening to this, a music podcast, on 3 times on your Apple podcast app, right? And we're just like flying around like chipmunks. It may be hard to get a point across. And so one thing I wanted to talk about, because I thought it was pretty amazing, honestly. I got this email that Tundig had been written about in AV Club in this article that was supposed to, I guess, like recap podcast episodes you should be listening to from the past week.
Or, I mean, it was literally just like, here's a roundup of 11 podcasts we found on the internet.
Yeah.
So pretty amazing we got included in that at all.
Yeah, so we're pretty stoked about that because we're not a part of any podcast network or anything like a lot of the other ones in this article. So it's pretty awesome that we are getting enough coverage thanks to the people who are listening to this and spreading the word that we're actually, hitting people's radar.
And also in the write-up is the Freaknik podcast from Mass Appeal, which is amazing.
Yeah. So we're definitely in territory we shouldn't be already in this article, right? But it was kind of funny, right? Because this guy who writes up about our episode, it was amazing because he has some pretty fundamental misunderstandings of some of the things that we said. And it was funny to share this and talk about this with you because we know that this happens, right? We know that people are listening to episodes once we're talking about a really important album. They're not taking away some nuanced point, or more likely, we didn't actually explain our point well enough, right? And so there were a few things in here that I think are interesting that can help you, the listener, learn more about us. Kind of like reading through this article and giving some responses I think will be helpful. This will not be as dull as it sounds like. So Craig, who wrote up this part of the article, says, at one point, one host, since they don't introduce themselves, you never know who's saying what. Okay, got it. All right. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Secondly, Craig, great use of the M- here in the article. But he said basically like one person claims that with all the music and mythology that Prince created during his time, because he's talking about our last Purple Rain episode, with all that music and mythology, that Prince is, quote, the textbook example of a difficult artist to get into. That is true. That is what we said and what we meant to say. His next sentence says, they practically spend this whole episode talking about an album that many Prince fans consider to be the perfect gateway to his discography. So this is a case of, the words that you're saying are actually the words that we're saying. We actually agree fully. It just sounds like maybe it didn't come across that way somehow. I don't know. Like when we say, or when you said, Kyle, this is a textbook example of a difficult artist to get into, and then we talk about how Purple Rain is the right one to get into that difficult artist, right? I interpreted that correctly from
correct.
you. Yeah. So like use Purple Rain to get into this Prince discography. Like that's one big thing we do on this podcast, like even with Can, right? Can will be a great episode to talk about how Tagamago probably isn't, quote, the most accessible record in the whole thing that they've created, but it's an entry point to an artist that can be weird or hard to get into. Like we try to do that on purpose.
We labor over that quite extensively. I think we have a list of over 100 artists and albums that we've already kind of road mapped, and we're constantly moving it around and deleting stuff as it feels like we've covered something similar or as we get great suggestions or whatever. But I think that's the thing that we labor over the most. It's like we're not going to pick the most obvious album necessarily. Like a lot of factors go into picking the exact right album, which is definitely something we did with Prince. Like, is it 1999? Is it Around the World in a Day? Do we go real esoteric and pick like a live bootleg from 1986?
Yeah, like picking a Sun record was insane.
Right. Yeah, we labored over that probably way more than we should. But it's important, right? Because everybody has a different perspective and you're going to have a completely different conversation based on these different albums. I mean, like with each of our favorite artists, like you with Zeppelin and me with Queens, we talked for a long time about which album we were going to pick. And so we know it's going to alter the whole direction of the conversation. So we try to be really intentional about that.
Yeah. So point taken. But for anyone who read that article or who was listening to that episode and somehow that came across weird, just making it clear, Purple Rain's a great place to get into Prince. And we thought about that in advance. Another thing that's interesting, right? So we've talked about like it can be hard to get across a point in a 30, 35 minute podcast that we're trying to stuff everything into. Sometimes things are just somehow heard as the literal opposite. And we need to clear the air about this particular one. Okay? Because this one was painful to read. Okay, so Craig writing the article here says, it's hard not to stop listening when one of them says that the Foo Fighters version of Darling Nikki is preferable to the down and dirty original. He then throws a gut punch and says in parentheses, you almost expect them to fawn over Mariah Carey's Cisco-fied cover of The Beautiful Ones. Well, let's talk about this very seriously here. I'm going to fold my fingers together. This is not what was said on this podcast. If Kyle had said that the Foo Fighters version of Darling Nikki is better than the original, you would never have heard that episode. We would have fought in the studio, the microphones would be broken, and there would be some form of blood and alcohol spilled.
And yet...
So as a clarification, not only to anyone who may have read this article, but also anyone who may have somehow heard that from us, we are sorry. We apologize to you. This mistake will never happen again. We will make sure that you understand when we're talking about, for instance, that I think what you said was, or what you meant was, the Foo Fighters version of Darling Nikki, because it was produced so much later and so much differently, helped you understand the kind of dynamic range of the song in, as opposed to the original recording, which was done in like we discussed at length, the production style and the way that some of these songs sound. And they have a very particular angle on them, some of them totally devoid of bass. Like
that was the main thing
right.
for me was there's a coldness through a lot of Purple Rain, and I didn't hear, because I wasn't there in that time and place and the sounds didn't sound as natural to me, I didn't hear as much of the like gnarliness, the grittiness, the stripperiness of the original. And so it just took somebody else interpreting the thing for me to hear the original as it needed to be. And I'm not ashamed to admit that that was how I got to that point. It was a combination of that Foo Fighters Darling Nikki cover and going back down the rabbit hole from Raheem the Dream back to The Beautiful Ones. I've never heard this Mariah Carey version, but if it's Cisco-fied, that probably means that I should listen to it. I'd be more into that than other Mariah Carey stuff.
Yeah, I want to be clear that neither of us have heard this song ever, not once.
And we're not going to because of this article.
It's done now. It's been finished.
I want to do something Cisco-fied on this season of the podcast. I don't know what that means, but I want to unpack over these 8 episodes what it means to Cisco-fi something.
So just send us $100 a month on Patreon and you'll get that whole Cisco season for free. It's exclusive.
If you send me $100 a month on Patreon, honestly, I might learn the choreography from the thong song.
But will we be able to see you against the backdrop of the sand is the real question.
I'm the same color as Cisco's hair. Oh, deep.
Oh, one last one. Actually reacting to things in reality as opposed to talking to records in the abstract is a really weird feeling. This last one I thought was cool. And again, just another quote from this article. He says, and yet, for all their damn near blasphemous hot takes, let's pause there for just a second.
My mom would be so happy to know I've been described as blasphemous.
The part about this that really bothers me is hot takes. I spend a lot of my time and energy in my life making sure that whatever the hell we talk about here is in fact not a hot take. I've been taking that take.
Every Cliff Seal take is room temperature.
Absolutely. Lukewarm takes at best. Okay? Put our takes out on the counter.
Catering left in the break room temperature takes.
This avocado is one day from turning brown and uneatable. Okay? These are not hot takes. But that said, fine. Quick shorthand for opinions you don't like. I understand that, right? So he says, a
millennial is just someone who's younger than me.
Did you know all millennials, even the youngest ones, are now out of college?
Yeah.
This is a ridiculous thing to be derogatory about.
There was a thing on Twitter recently where Gen Z kids were discovering that they weren't actually millennials, and they were like, y'all been talking all this shit about us the whole time?
Just reaction videos of them finding out, oh, word?
Gen Z sounds tight. I sound like I'm from the future.
So he says, and yet, for all their damn near blasphemous hot takes, these guys, in their own relentlessly hyperbolic way, which, okay, now we agree. I want to be relentlessly hyperbolic in pretty much everything because what else is worth listening to? Give me some opinions, right? So some like informed opinions, but that's exactly what we meant by density. Like, sure, we're going to try to pack a bunch of, if we're going to have an opinion, it's going to at least be backed by some sort of logic or history or something, but we're going to pack a lot of them in, right? It says, in their own relentlessly hyperbolic way, they're obviously representing all those vinyl heads who love getting into debates at record stores. He then goes on to acknowledge that we actually did acknowledge the importance of that Prince record, which is good, because if the last part of his write-up can come back to, it does feel like you covered the main most important things about this record, kick ass then. That's exactly what we're looking for. But let's talk just a moment about vinyl heads who love getting into debates at record stores. Here's a fun fact about me. I don't own a record player.
Or any vinyl, right?
No.
Yeah.
No. And that's why I still have some money in my
yeah.
bank account. Yeah. Like, I don't do that on purpose. I listen to so much music and would want to collect so much of it and love art so much. That would be a major problem for me. So instead, like, I try to invest in, good headphones. Like, I have microphone amps or headphone amps. They come out of my computer and stuff, and I try to make the sound quality good coming out there, right? But, just to be clear, I love giving away vinyl because it's super fun to get vinyl, right? If somebody gave me a record, fine. That's tight. I would put that up on a wall, honestly, or something like that. And then secondly, getting into debates at record stores. This has not happened since the early 80s in reality, okay? No one is at a record store actually arguing about anything
I'll
anymore.
say the first time that I ever went to Criminal Records in 2003 or 4, Criminal Records in Little 5 Points in Atlanta. Friends of ours, we love and appreciate them. I was a kid in high school, and they were arguing about, it was somebody that I had never heard of at that time and think I don't care for. At the time, I think they were arguing about Stephen Malkmus or Bob Mould or somebody that was like, okay, I'm just here for the one Mark Lanigan CD that I can't find at Best Buy in my suburban hometown. So it was still happening at that time, but I don't feel like it's happening as much anymore. Now they just do it on the internet.
Yeah, fine. It happened once since 1980s. And kids were going between arcades and skate parks and record stores and talking with each other. We don't do that anymore. We have phone devices we can talk into.
Well,
why talk to anybody?
It's just screaming to the void.
That's right. Well, the void responds to you with a pleasant voice. Okay, I'll remind you of the existentialism of your reality.
I also think a lot of people probably don't know how we arrived at giving away vinyl for every episode.
Oh, yeah.
So a little bit of a story. We started a website where it was social reviewing for albums. Cliff built it entirely on WordPress, and it was meant to be able to simulate the experience of getting recommendations on new albums from your friends rather than from algorithms or from critical air quote experts. We did that for a little while and then pivoted away to working with record stores. They saw it and they saw the data possibility. So we wound up getting linked up with Eric Levin, who founded Criminal Records in Atlanta and was a co-founder of Record Store Day. And he's been a buddy of ours for a long time. And we have been working with the Alliance of Independent Media Stores sort of quietly, sort of behind the scenes outside of our day jobs for 6, 7, 8 years now.
Yeah, something like that.
A hot minute.
Yeah.
And as part of that, we started accumulating all of these promo copy CDs and vinyl, and it started stacking up. And the podcast honestly started as a way, what if we use this as a way to just give away this vinyl? We had a newsletter at one point when we were sort of trying to do the B2B industry thing with TuneDig, which we conceived as a consultancy way before it was ever a podcast. And when a weekly newsletter got too cumbersome to do, we were like, what if we just did what we always wanted to do the whole time and just talked about albums and just create a community that way? So we're back at our origin point a little bit, and it's a great way to give away vinyl, which is just a fun thing to do. There's no point in doing it other than just bringing small joy to somebody, especially when these records are kind of hard to track down. Like that Mars Volta cassette. Please, if anyone knows anyone who knows anyone in the Mars Volta camp, please tell them to re-release those early albums on vinyl. I think they were on WB at that time.
Yeah.
Their major label.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
Them or Sony? Yeah.
They're so expensive
Yeah.
on eBay and Discogs. I think they like start at $300 a piece.
Francis the Mute was a mess. Bless the Martyr and Kiss the Child was a mess. And then we had to like throw warnings and caveats all over the Channel Orange one, right? Just so you know, there are only bootlegs. Only bootlegs exist. You're about to get one.
C'est la vie, baby.
Yeah.
So yeah, this was a little bit of a journey down the rabbit hole. And if you've listened to this episode, we appreciate you taking the time to get a little deeper into our headspace. We wanted to toss this off kind of and get it out of our system so that we could do everything that we mentioned in this episode and spend season 4 focusing on the music.
Yeah, because we're not changing anything. We still did it right.
I'm not necessarily saying that.
Classic Cliff. I'm going to keep doing it, but let me explain myself for an hour if you don't mind.
Cliff's a Libra. We are so grateful for all of the feedback. It's cool to know that there are a community of people out there who care about music in many of the same ways that we do and like a lot of the same music that we do. Cliff and I, just the two of us, have such a weirdly narrow and specific overlap between the things that we really like a lot. That 10% is very specific and intense, but the other 90% could not be more different. And that's really been like the crux of our entire friendship for 15 years now. And music is just a vehicle for staying connected to yourself and to other people you love and to the world. And it's been that for us. And so really that's what this podcast is about. It's more about life than it is about these albums. To me, anyway, it's become that way. So sorry if I ever veer into like really heady, like dude with a Bob Marley poster in your dorm room type territory. But
we think of it that way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's how we approach it. And honestly, that 10% of crossover you're talking about, I mean, take what we've done and apply it to other people if you can, right? In all seriousness, there's never been a more important time to try to find that 10% of overlap you have with other people. I think the way society has evolved and probably just still the effects of the internet trickling through our psyche, it feels like we're further and further apart from each individual person, not just groups and polarization, but it feels like there's never been more contrast between you and everyone else that you're around. And I'm not saying that shitty people aren't shitty people still, but a lot of those shitty people have a 10% that you can gather around. You don't have to forgive the other parts of them that are terrible, but if you can find overlap with a human being, you can create a sense of connection and have a conversation with them about something that's meaningful. If you find yourself talking about something that isn't in that 10%, try to steer your way towards it. I mean, it's just a way to connect with people. It builds our relationship together, you know? Like, we learn more about each other through talking about this stuff that we feel like we already knew. When we draw things out we hadn't before. It's a fun way to approach things that you care about.
So what we're saying is try to find common ground and something to love about everyone except Nazis and billionaires. And
they probably got something too, but don't worry about it for now.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we hope that you enjoy season 4 because we are very excited about these albums. They're quite different from stuff that we've done before, and we're excited to break into new territory together.
And if you got more feedback, seriously, hit us up. We're listening.
You know where to find us.
Exactly.
At TuneDig on all platforms. Do we have an email? hello@tunedig.com?
Hell no, at tunedig.com. Yeah, you can always hit Cliff or Kyle at tunedig.com.
Cliff666 at tunedig.com.
So yeah, see you at season 4.
Bye.